Pandora sat in front of her cottage and watched the sun come up over what had once been her grove, but now was just a field of charred stumps. All of the olives were gone. One tree remained, a single towering sycamore that, with its former fellows, had once formed a large ring around the grove. That ring of sycamores had been the reason her mother settled upon this very plot of land. She'd told Pandora those sycamores had called for a grove of olives in the center and a girl to play amongst them. Pandora was thankful that at least one of them had been preserved. As well, she was grateful for the mysterious magpie. The bird's panicked screeching had roused her from a sound sleep the night before. She'd been horrified to see the poor thing batter itself wildly about the cage. She was afraid the bird would do herself an injury. An impulse made her open the little door to free her. The magpie flew straight at the door of the cottage, swerving sharply at the last possible second to turn and fly straight back towards the hearth. She continued the pattern back and forth, squawking the whole time, back and forth so fast. Pandora knew without question that the bird wanted outside, so she flung open the door and followed as the bird flew out and down the hill. Bright flames against the night sky. Her olive grove was on fire. She dashed back into the house, grabbed an armful of woolens, and tossed them in the cistern. She quickly hauled them back out, tied one of the shawls around her face, and ran down the hill, arms laden with dripping wet wool. The magpie was flying in high circles above the burning trees. She set to work systematically, slapping the sodden wool against the trees, dousing the flames she could reach, and doing the best she could to minimize the spreading. An hour later, she sat amidst the smoldering ruins, under the sycamore tree she had been able to save. It was still dark. Morning was at least another hour away. As she rose to head back down to her cottage, she heard the sound of a woman's laughter moving away from the grove and off down towards the road. She could not see in the dark, but she knew that laughter well. She gathered up the remains of her market goods, as well as a handful of other household and personal items that she decided against hauling along on her journey, and loaded them onto her cart. She brought out the twin ewe lambs, the last of her herd, and led them onto the cart. She arrived at the market just in time to catch Anna and Katerina leaving. They exchanged quick greetings, and Pandora said goodbye to her sheep. She could not be too sad, as they were going to a good mistress, with pastures that produced the sweetest grasses in the village. There they would thrive. As she set up her stall, fellow villagers came by and quietly whispered words of sympathy over the loss of her grove. But where the names of the arsonists might be spoken, there existed only a hushed, tensed silence. They brought her amphora of wine, strong, sturdy rugs, and baskets of provisions to take with her to the house by the sea. Their kindness and generosity heartened her. They all spoke with certainty. Her expedition would bring her good fortune. Her final visit to the market would have been one perfect, sweet memory of leave-taking had Verdulaka not appeared. Late in the morning, she sauntered slowly up to her stall. She wore that familiar, tiny little purse-lipped smile. It reminded Pandora of the tightly wrapped bud on a poisonous flower. The magpie, who had never gone back into her cage after the fire in the olive grove, and now kept her mistress within sight at all times, immediately began to bitch and complain. Pandora's suspicions were confirmed. She lowered her gaze and refused to meet the young woman's eyes. "So, tomorrow is your big day, Verdulaka sneered as she picked up a baby blanket, one of the last things Pandora's mother had woven before she died. Shame about your grove. She picked at the blanket carelessly. Pandora felt a wave of heat spread from the top of her head to the tips of her toes. At the same time, an icy coldness bloomed deep inside her chest. She wanted to tear the blanket out of the creature's dirty claws. She wanted to scream and cry at the same time, but instead she dipped her head and tried to concentrate on the ground in front of her feet. She would not react. Stone-faced, eyes locked on the ground, she recited a comforting little verse inside of her head and forced herself to breathe deeply, in and out, slowly. You can't begin to understand what you're heading out into, Verdolaka laughed. You will make a fine meal for the first thing that crosses your path. You'll be lucky to come crawling back, bleeding and broken. And when you do, I shall still be here. You will never escape. The hard edge of her voice struck Pandora like a blow. Verdolaka had never openly threatened her before. Over the course of the last year, their interactions had deteriorated, and, until this moment, Verdolaka had been all subtle intimidation, arch, polite overacting, ironic verbal jabs, and long silent stares. But now it was real, and now the ground beneath Pandora felt shaky and unreal. Her pulse became thready, and her heart fluttered in her chest, battering about her ribcage like the magpie last night. She was afraid she might throw up. She closed her eyes before her vision started to cave too far in, and then the tips of her fingers and her ears grew ice cold, and she felt the cold surging inside of her. A 5.5-minute hallway stretched far out in front of her, and she began to tip forward, the taste of bile and old, sweet pink wine in the back of her throat. The room was black and she was spinning. She could hear Mazzy Star faintly coming from somewhere, and she wanted to scream no, but she couldn't speak. This was all a huge mistake, and somehow it was all her fault, and she wanted to go back and stamp it out, blot it out forever, make it all never happen. She opened her eyes and Verdolaka was gone. She looked around in vain for the magpie. Nobody seemed to notice what had just happened. The marketplace was its usual landscape of peaceful commerce and convivial gossip. With shaking hands, Pandora began to pack up her stall, doing her very best to appear calm and serene as she said her final goodbyes to the village and prepared to return home for a final night in her cottage. As she secured the villagers' gifts to her cart, the magpie casually returned, landed on her perch, and began to preen in her typical offhand manner. When the magpie woke Pandora up again late that night with her loud screeching and cawing, she hadn't hesitated for a second. She'd flown out of bed, flung open the door, and followed the magpie out and down the hill. There was nothing to see but the dark night sky, and nothing to hear in the silence of the fields around her. The bird flew ahead in the moonlight, and so she followed. She was led to the barn, where she found Verdolaka's mother looming over the two little ewes. A knife gleamed in the moonlight, and Pandora saw it flash as the woman's arm came down. The magpie dove onto the woman's head, and Pandora hurled herself bodily against her. They tumbled against the wall of the barn. She heard Verdolaka shriek and saw feathers flying, and then Verdolaka's mother was up, and the two of them were running away. Pandora climbed back to her feet to see the magpie chasing them out of the barn. She quickly examined both sheep as well as the donkeys, and found only a small but deep and rather bloody cut on the right ear of one of the little lambs. She ran to fetch a lamp and her medicine box, and returned to clean up the injured ear and apply a poultice. She was glad she was leaving that day. She did not think she could take much more. Though the wound on the little lamb had been small, there was a shocking amount of blood splashed about the barn. As she was raking it out, the bird returned, flew back into the barn, and alighted on a rafter where she settled in quietly. Pandora watched the magpie survey the barn and its immediate environs with a calm but vigilant gaze, and felt strangely comforted. She settled herself down amongst the donkeys and the sheep. She would stay with them until dawn broke, and then return to the cottage to pack up and leave. She awoke to bright sunshine in her eyes. For a moment she was dazzled and could not remember where she was, and looked about the barn confused. The sight of the magpie, wide awake, watching her, reminded her of the previous night's events, and she looked around for the sheep. They were gone. Her heart dropped into her stomach, and she jumped up to search for them. Then, just as suddenly, she remembered that she had taken the twin ewes to the market and given them over to Anna and Katerina just the day before. They hadn't been in the barn. They could not have been attacked by Verdulaka's mother. She sank back down to the floor of the barn and sat quite still for several minutes, trying to understand what had happened. She raised her eyes to the magpie and asked, "Did last night happen?" The bird stared back at her, unblinking. She knew that she could turn all of this over and over in her head and not find a solution, and so she turned her mind from it into the task at hand. She brought the donkeys up close to the cottage. Dawn would break in another hour or so, and it would be time to leave anyway. She wanted all of her companions close by, where she could keep an eye on them. And now dawn had broken. The magpie was perched on the seat next to her. The wagon was packed. The cottage was closed up and quiet. It had nothing left to tell her. She shook the reins, and they started off. The magpie flew off of the bench and out in front of her, leading the way that would take her by Kiryapuli's home as she left the village. Pandora watched the road ahead of her, not looking back even once because she was not yet ready to cry. They followed the road away from the village, past the cottage that belonged to Verdulaka and her mother. The door and windows were wide open, but all was dark within. The mangled wreckage of the garden was strewn with tools and trash. There were no squirrels, deer, or foxes to be found. Not a bird would perch on their land, making it a strangely silent place. Pandora couldn't help but stare as they passed the house. She thought she could see malignant shadows dart and dip around the trees and onto the roof. The magpie chattered bitterly ahead of her until the cottage slipped from view. They passed several more farms and then approached Kiryapuli's small bungalow. The chimney smoked cozily as the chickens happily clucked and pecked amongst the silk flowers. Pandora directed the donkeys to halt as the old woman, her elegant aubergine robes trailing behind her, exited the cottage with arms outstretched to welcome her. She climbed down from the wagon and bit her lip hard against the tears she had been fighting back from the moment she saw her grove lit up in flames against the night sky. "What is this? What has happened now?" Kiryapuli asked her. Pandora explained that she'd been woken by the magpie the night before, and she'd followed the bird down to the barn to find the old nurse standing over her sheep, ready to kill them before the bird had stopped her. Kiryapuli tutted. "I'm haunted by the promises I've made, and others I have broken." Pandora shook her head. "Don't cry. There's always a way," Kiryapuli replied. "Here in Penepsion, in this house of flowers, we'll pray." And they bowed their heads together silently for a moment. "Please, I know it's hard to believe," Kiryapuli said, pouring tea, "to see a perfect forest through so many splintered trees." The two talked for more than an hour, Kiryapuli reassuring her that the burnt grove would eventually see regrowth. The two sheep were safe in the care of Anna and Katerina, and Pandora did indeed possess all she needed to see her through this journey. She must not fear the curses of strange shades. Finally, Kiryapuli reminded her that the magpie, who had been snoozing comfortably on the hearth, was clearly a ewe-demon, and her trust was well placed. Pandora made a sign of great blessing and nodded deeply. "I am lucky," she agreed. "I will have faith." Pandora said her goodbyes, and climbed up onto the cart, and the magpie flew down to perch beside her. She waved goodbye to Kiriapuli, picked up the reins, turned to the magpie and said, "You and me, and these shadows keep on changing." The bird cackled something back at her, and then took off to lead her away. Just a couple of hours later, and the sun was high in the sky. Pandora was rather surprised to find that they were well on their way to the Temple of the Flying Lady. This was a road she had not often traveled. Lots of rolling hillsides, and soon the air began to feel different, cooler and fresher. And while she could not see the ocean, nor could she smell it, she could feel whispers of sea air on her skin as they rounded a corner. She must have been 8 or 9 years old that first time. It had been such a long, unfamiliar drive. Before they'd even left the driveway, her mother had a present for her. She had torn off the wrapping and was very excited to find the soundtrack to the movie they had watched the night before. She carefully inserted the tape into the car stereo, and off they went, with Kira singing to them. No, her name couldn't be Kira. Maybe Cleo, or Terpsichore, or Calliope. But there was no Kira, she knew that much. When they finally got there, they parked in a big lot and crossed a very busy street. They entered an enormous building with a lot of other people. Her mother made an offering for the two of them, and they walked through a dark corridor which led to a room that enveloped them like a soft black cloud, where the walls, made of black velvet, went up and up and up, and up there, suspended high in the cool, peaceful darkness, were the women. Motionless, they hung quiescent in space, neither alive nor dead, but all-knowing and all-seeing, witnesses. Her mother made a small obeisance before each of them, and suddenly Pandora was aware that her mother was crying, dipping her head before this display. "I'm haunted by the lives that I have loved and the actions I have hated," she heard her mother whisper. "I'm haunted by the lives that wove the web inside my haunted head." Pandora watched as her mother walked into the black velvet wall and disappeared before her eyes. Pandora looked up at the ladies suspended before her and said, "You, won't you say something? I need to get my bearings." And in her mind blossomed a flower, half dark and half light, half afraid and half brave, half panic and half resolve. The siren's cry of panic was very loud, but the call of a bird sliced through it from somewhere up in the black velvety darkness, and she suddenly understood that she was tucked safely under the magpie's wing. She nodded and wiped the tears from her eyes as she stepped forward into the darkness of those hallways where the shadows kept on changing.